You guys today, DJonai Carrington, after clotheslining Sophie Cunningham, running into the locker room, screaming, "That's white privilege!" Then tweeting 8/23, threatening Sophie Cunningham and the Indiana Fever. DJonai Carrington now comes out and clarifies what she means when she says white privilege for the Indiana Fever.
So with 2 minutes left in the first quarter, DJonai Carrington just slapped the dog shit out of Sophie Cunningham. Sophie pops up. She's obviously upset. DJonai says, "Try me." And then look at Stephanie White. Look at her face. Look. She's mad as shit. Now, number one, this is obviously a flagrant 2. It just is. By the letter of the law, you got to call a flagrant 2. We all know these refs.
That girl needs to be thrown out the league. She's not even a good enough player to be bringing this type of drama. She needs to be thrown out.
One hard foul was already enough to ignite the WNBA, but what happened immediately afterward turned a basketball moment into a full-blown controversy. DJ Carrington was ejected after a brutal collision with Sophie Cunningham, and within moments, Carrington posted 2 words online that sent social media into overdrive: white privilege. Suddenly, the conversation wasn't just about a flagrant foul anymore.
Sophie Cunningham, otherwise known as MAGA Barbie in the WNBA, is a superstar player. She's one of the most famous female athletes in the world because she stood up for women in women's sports, saying only biological women should be allowed to play in the WNBA. And for that, she is literally risking her life. Check this out. This is what happened to Sophie Cunningham last night when she was clotheslined by a filthy, dirty player for Chicago who has a name that I can't pronounce, or maybe I just refuse to do that. That's my right as an American. But this is a player that has attacked Caitlin Clark, gouged her eye out, that has now bloodied the face of Sophie Cunningham. And as soon as she did this, she tweeted white privilege, meaning she's declaring this is a race crime. Now, if a white woman was doing this to black women, it'd be the #1 story in the world. She'd be banned from the league forever. But somehow black women are allowed to get away with this against white women. And it's white women in the league who make themselves a target by simply standing up for traditional values and common sense.
Fans, analysts, former players, and commentators all began asking the same question. What exactly did Carrington mean? And when she later pushed back against the criticism, claiming people had misunderstood her message, the controversy only became bigger. Now, the real story is what happened next.
Ew! That's assault, brother. You can't do that. What the fuck? Is this just the default if you can't think? Or if you just don't want to take accountability for your actions? Oh my god, this league, bro, this league. Bro, white privilege while you're wearing a bleach blonde dyed wig. I mean, the fuck? What is privileged about that? You stone cold Steve Austin clotheslined her ass. What about that is white privilege? The WNBA stays undefeated. It truly does. They can't get out of their own way.
The entire controversy started with a play that lasted only a few seconds, but those few seconds were enough to change the tone of the game completely. Sophie Cunningham was attacking the basket in transition when DJ Carrington was chasing from behind. Cunningham had a clear path toward the rim, and Carrington was trying to make a defensive play before the shot could be completed. But instead of cleanly reaching for the basketball, Carrington made contact high on Cunningham's body. The impact sent Cunningham to the floor. For a moment, the basketball itself almost became irrelevant. Players stopped moving. The officials immediately focused on Cunningham, who had taken a hard hit and was visibly furious about what had just happened.
It's beyond concerning at this point how far from the plot we have actually gotten. And when I say the plot, I mean the basketball. How far from the game of basketball we have spiraled. When we're talking about the WNBA, we used to joke, it's like, 0 days without drama in the WNBA. This league is living up to it at a rate and a level of concern that we haven't ever had. with all the discussion.
Craziness going on in the WNBA. DJonai Carrington tweeted out white privilege from the locker room of a game that she was playing in. Get this, she fouls Sophie Cunningham hard. Sophie Cunningham, obviously a white person, fouls her hard. Flagrant 2, gets ejected, goes to the locker room and tweets out white privilege in the middle of the game. Now here's the kicker to me. A flagrant 2 has to be contact that can lead to an injury that looks excessive. DJonai, it was about as excessive as possible. If there was any evidence of there being white privilege, this was not it. What the hell do y'all think?
And then the replay made the situation even more controversial. Officials reviewed the play and ultimately upgraded the foul to a flagrant 2, resulting in Carrington's ejection. From the officials' perspective, the issue wasn't about personalities, rivalries, or social media. The concern was the nature of the contact and the potential for injury. But the moment Carrington left the court, the story took a completely different direction. Instead of ending with an ejection, the incident followed Carrington into the locker room and then onto social media. She posted 2 words, white privilege. That's it. No long explanation, no detailed context, no immediate clarification explaining exactly what she was referring to. Just those 2 words. And because of the timing, people immediately started connecting the post to what had just happened on the court. Cunningham had been the player on the receiving end of the foul. Carrington had been ejected, and Cunningham's team, the Indiana Fever, was directly connected to the post. That combination created an explosion online. Some people interpreted Carrington's message as a criticism of how the foul had been handled. Others believed she was making a broader statement about Cunningham's position within the league, and some argued that everyone was jumping to conclusions without knowing Carrington's actual intention. That distinction became extremely important, because there are really 2 separate questions here. The first question is simple. Was the foul serious enough to justify an ejection? The officials clearly believed it was. The second question is much more complicated. What exactly did Carrington mean when she wrote white privilege? And that question would eventually become bigger than the foul itself. Sophie Cunningham was already a player who attracted plenty of attention away from the court. She had become closely associated with Caitlin Clark during her time with the Fever, and she had openly discussed the physical treatment Clark received during games. That background mattered because Cunningham wasn't entering this controversy as an unknown player. She already had a public image. She already had supporters. She already had critics. And because of her connection to Clark, almost anything involving Cunningham could quickly become part of the much larger debate surrounding the Fever and the attention surrounding Clark. So when Cunningham took the hard hit from Carrington, people didn't watch the moment in isolation. They immediately brought the larger story with them. Was this simply an aggressive defensive play that went too far? Was it part of the normal physicality of professional basketball? Or was there something more behind it? At this point, there was no clear evidence establishing Carrington's personal motive. That's an important distinction. A hard foul can be judged by what actually happened on the court. Determining why a player made that foul is much more difficult. And that is exactly where this controversy started getting messy. Cunningham got back to her feet, and the emotions were obvious. Carrington also appeared fired up as she left the court. The atmosphere suggested that there was plenty of tension between the players in that moment. But then came the social media post. White privilege. Those words transformed what could have been a normal basketball debate into something much bigger. Suddenly, sports commentators were discussing race. Fans were debating whether the post referred to the foul. Others were asking why Carrington would use those words immediately after being ejected. And the timing became one of the biggest arguments against her. Critics essentially said, if the post wasn't about the foul, then why post it at that exact moment? Supporters of Carrington had a different response. They argued that the public didn't actually know what she meant. And that distinction would become even more important once Carrington herself addressed the backlash. Because Carrington eventually pushed back against the idea that she was saying the officials gave her a flagrant 2 because Cunningham was white. In other words, she argued that people had created a connection between 2 things that she had never explicitly connected. And now the controversy had entered a new phase. The question was no longer simply whether Carrington committed a flagrant foul. The question became whether her post had been misunderstood, or whether the timing made the meaning obvious to anyone watching. That's where the debate surrounding Emmanuel Acho would enter the picture. Acho would challenge Carrington's explanation directly, arguing that if you use a phrase as loaded as white privilege immediately after a controversial incident, you can't be surprised when people interpret it as a reaction to that incident. Carrington wasn't about to let that criticism go unanswered, and her response would add another layer to a controversy that had already moved far beyond the basketball court. Because at this point, one flagrant foul had created an argument about race, social media, player rivalries, Caitlin Clark, Sophie Cunningham, and the culture surrounding the WNBA. And the next response was about to make the entire situation even more complicated. The controversy might have ended with Carrington's ejection if she had simply accepted the decision and moved on. But the white privilege post changed everything. What made the situation so explosive wasn't only the words themselves. It was the timing. Carrington had just been removed from the game after the officials reviewed the contact with Sophie Cunningham. Then, almost immediately afterward, those two words appeared online. People didn't need a long explanation to start asking questions. Was Carrington saying the foul was called because Cunningham was white? Was she talking about the way Cunningham was treated by fans? Was she referring to something completely unrelated? Carrington later made it clear that, according to her, people had misunderstood the meaning. But by then, the internet had already made up its mind. And that's where Emmanuel Aiko entered the conversation. Aiko challenged the logic behind Carrington's explanation. His argument was fairly straightforward. If you post an extremely loaded phrase immediately after a controversial ejection and connect it to the team involved, people are naturally going to assume the two events are related. His criticism wasn't necessarily that Carrington wasn't allowed to discuss race. His issue was the lack of context. And that distinction matters. If someone simply writes white privilege with no explanation, millions of people can interpret those words in completely different ways. But when those words appear directly after a white player has been involved in a controversial incident, the connection becomes almost impossible to ignore. Carrington, however, wasn't backing down. She argued that she had never actually said the flagrant foul itself was an example of white privilege. According to her explanation, that was an assumption made by other people. She pushed back against the criticism and suggested that commentators should think more carefully before deciding what she meant. That response created another debate, because now there were two different interpretations competing against each other. Carrington was essentially saying, "You assumed what I meant." Her critics were responding, "You gave us almost no other context." And both sides believed they had the stronger argument. This is one of the reasons social media controversies become so difficult to control. A player can post something in seconds, but once millions of people begin interpreting that post, the original meaning can become almost impossible to recover. And in this case, the controversy had another ingredient: Sophie Cunningham's growing profile. Cunningham had become one of the more recognizable personalities surrounding the Indiana Fever. Her connection with Caitlin Clark meant that she was constantly part of conversations that extended beyond ordinary basketball coverage. She had also been vocal about the physical treatment Clark received on the court. That made her supporters even more protective of her after the Carrington incident. To them, this wasn't simply another hard foul. They saw it as another example of a player connected to Clark being involved in a physical confrontation. But there was an important problem with that argument. A previous incident doesn't automatically prove that the latest incident had the same motive. That's where separating fact from interpretation becomes critical. The verified part of the story was relatively simple. There was a hard collision. Carrington was ejected. Cunningham was visibly angry. Carrington posted white privilege. Then the public argument began. Everything beyond those facts required interpretation. And that's exactly what made the debate so intense. Some commentators accused Carrington of deliberately targeting Cunningham. Others believed it was an aggressive basketball play that became dangerous because of where the contact landed. Even people who agreed the foul deserved a flagrant 2 didn't necessarily agree about Carrington's intention. That's an important distinction. A play can be dangerous without being premeditated. A player can make a reckless decision without entering the possession intending to injure someone. And unless there is direct evidence of motive, it's difficult to know what was happening inside Carrington's head at that exact moment. But online debates rarely wait for evidence. They move according to emotion, and this controversy was moving extremely fast. Then another reaction added fuel to the fire. Sydney Colson, who had previously been a teammate of Cunningham, reacted publicly to the incident. That reaction immediately attracted attention because of their history together. A former teammate responding positively to a hard foul involving another former teammate creates a completely different kind of storyline. Now the conversation wasn't just about Carrington and Cunningham. People were asking whether there were deeper tensions between players connected to the fever. But again, it's important not to turn a social media reaction into proof of a larger conspiracy. A reaction can show emotion. It doesn't automatically explain the entire relationship between two players. Still, from a content perspective, the reaction mattered because it demonstrated just how divided opinions had become. And then came Stephanie White. As Cunningham's coach, White was naturally asked about the incident. Her response was more measured than some of the reactions online. White indicated that she didn't believe Carrington necessarily intended to make contact with Cunningham's neck, while also acknowledging that the foul itself was hard. That created another layer of debate. Some fans wanted a stronger defense of Cunningham. Others saw White's comments as a reasonable distinction between intent and outcome. And that distinction may actually be the most important part of the entire controversy. In basketball, intent and impact aren't always the same thing. A player can reach for the ball and still make dangerous contact. A player can attempt a legitimate defensive play and still be responsible for a flagrant foul. The rules don't require officials to read someone's mind. They evaluate the action that happened on the floor. That's why the ejection itself is much easier to analyze than the social media controversy that followed it. The officials had the replay, they saw the contact, they evaluated the danger of the play, and they made their decision. The online debate, however, had no replay system. It had assumptions. It had previous rivalries. It had political opinions. It had racial arguments. And it had fans who were already divided before the foul ever happened. That's why the phrase white privilege became so powerful. It gave everyone a completely different lens through which to view the same basketball play. For one side, the phrase suggested Carrington was pointing toward a larger issue. For another side, it appeared to be an accusation that the officials had treated Cunningham differently because of her race. And for many neutral viewers, the simplest reaction was, why did she post that immediately after getting ejected? That question wasn't going away, and neither was the backlash. Carrington eventually defended herself again, arguing that she understood the historical and social meaning of the phrase and would not casually use it without understanding what she was saying. But that explanation didn't satisfy everyone. Her critics argued that understanding a phrase doesn't automatically make the original post clear. Her supporters argued that critics were putting words into her mouth. And somewhere in the middle was the reality that social media had turned a few seconds of basketball into a massive public argument. At this point, the controversy wasn't really about whether Carrington should have been ejected anymore. That part was already settled. The bigger question was what the incident revealed about the atmosphere surrounding the WNBA. Because the league is now under a level of attention that makes every major confrontation much bigger than it would have been years ago. Caitlin Clark has brought enormous mainstream attention to the league. Sophie Cunningham has become part of that wider conversation. Carrington has her own reputation and history within the league. And when those worlds collide, even one hard defensive play can become a national debate. But there was still one major question left unanswered. Did Carrington actually mean that Cunningham received special treatment because she was white? Or did the internet connect two separate things because of the timing? And that question would become the central battle of the controversy. At this point, the basketball play itself was almost becoming the least important part of the story. The foul had already been reviewed. The officials had already made their decision. DJ Carrington was already out of the game. But the debate surrounding those two words, white privilege, was still growing. And this is where the story becomes much more complicated. Because there are two things that can be true at the same time. Carrington can believe that people misunderstood her. And the public can still reasonably question why she chose those words immediately after being ejected. Those positions don't necessarily cancel each other out. The problem is that social media leaves very little room for nuance. A short post can create a massive reaction before the person who wrote it has even had a chance to explain themselves. That's exactly what happened here. Critics saw the timing and assumed the meaning. Carrington saw those assumptions and pushed back. Then commentators joined the argument. Then former players and fans joined. And suddenly, a single WNBA game had become another battle in the much larger debate surrounding race, politics, Caitlin Clark, and the future direction of women's basketball. But there's another issue that shouldn't be ignored. The physicality of the WNBA has been under a microscope for quite some time. Players compete at an extremely high level. Fast breaks happen in seconds. Defenders are trying to stop players before they reach the rim. And sometimes, a legitimate attempt to make a defensive play turns into dangerous contact. That doesn't mean every hard foul should be excused. It means we have to be careful about automatically assuming motive. In Carrington's case, the officials determined that the contact was serious enough for a flagrant 2. That's a basketball judgment. Whether Carrington personally intended to injure Cunningham is a completely separate question. And unless she says exactly what was going through her mind during that play, nobody watching from the outside can know with certainty. This is where some of the strongest claims surrounding the incident become difficult to prove. There were people saying Carrington targeted Cunningham because of her political beliefs. Others claimed the foul was connected to Cunningham's support of Caitlin Clark. But those are conclusions about motive. The footage can show what happened. Can't automatically show why someone did it. That's why the most defensible criticism of Carrington is actually much simpler. The foul was dangerous. The officials reviewed it. She was ejected. And her social media post created unnecessary confusion. You don't need to prove a political motive to make that argument. And you don't need to dismiss the racial context either. If Carrington intended the post to address a broader issue involving race or privilege, she had every right to explain that position. But once the post became public, other people also had the right to question what she meant. That is the unavoidable trade-off of speaking publicly. And Emmanuel Ako's argument essentially centered on that point. He wasn't telling people that they had to agree with Carrington. He was saying that when you use a highly charged phrase without explaining the target of your criticism, you're giving the audience room to interpret it. Carrington's response suggested that people should have used more critical thinking. But critics turned that argument around. They said critical thinking requires evidence. And if the original post contains only 2 words, there isn't much context to analyze. That's why the clarification became almost as controversial as the original post. Instead of ending the argument, it gave both sides more material. And then the conversation returned to Sophie Cunningham. Cunningham's role in this story is interesting because she has become a lightning rod for completely different reasons. Some fans see her as a player willing to defend her teammates. Others view her public positions much more critically. Her connection with Caitlin Clark makes everything around her more visible. And that means even a normal basketball confrontation can quickly become part of an existing culture war narrative. That's probably the biggest lesson from this entire situation. The WNBA isn't operating in a vacuum anymore. Every major game is being watched by people who aren't necessarily watching purely for basketball. Some viewers are following Caitlin Clark. Some people looked at the Carrington Cunningham incident and connected it to previous physical moments involving Caitlin Clark. Others looked at Cunningham's public comments and connected them to broader political disagreements. Still others saw the entire situation as evidence that the WNBA is divided internally. But individual incidents don't automatically prove those larger theories. What they can prove is that emotions are high. Players are competitive. Fans are deeply invested. And the league is operating under an unprecedented spotlight. That spotlight has benefits. More viewers, more attention, more opportunities, more revenue, more recognition for the players. But there is a downside too. Every mistake becomes content. Every argument becomes a headline. Every social media post can become a national controversy. And every player now has to understand that something written in anger or frustration can follow them far longer than the original game. That's why the Carrington post became so important. If she had never posted those 2 words, the conversation might have remained focused on the foul. People would have debated whether the flagrant 2 was justified. They would have discussed Cunningham's reaction. They would have moved on to the next game. Instead, the phrase white privilege created an entirely new storyline. And once that storyline started, it was almost impossible to control. The most interesting part is that Carrington's later explanation actually introduces uncertainty rather than eliminating it. If she truly wasn't saying that the foul itself was an example of white privilege, then what exactly was she referring to? That's the question critics continue to ask. But there's another side to that question. If Carrington says that wasn't what she meant, Should viewers accept that explanation? There isn't a perfect answer. People are allowed to judge public statements based on timing and context. But they're also supposed to leave room for the possibility that the original interpretation was wrong. That's where responsible commentary becomes different from internet outrage. You can criticize the foul. You can criticize the post. You can question the timing. But claiming to know exactly what Carrington intended without direct evidence goes beyond what the footage can establish. And the same standard should apply to everyone involved. We shouldn't assume Cunningham's reaction proves she had a larger political agenda. We shouldn't assume Colson's reaction proves an entire locker room hates Cunningham. We shouldn't assume Stephanie White's comments prove she was siding against her own player. And we shouldn't assume Carrington's foul automatically proves she wanted to injure Cunningham. The evidence doesn't support certainty on all of those questions. What we do know is enough to make the story significant. A hard foul led to an ejection. A social media post transformed that basketball decision into a race-related controversy. A public response from Carrington failed to end the debate. Emmanuel Aiko challenged her explanation. Other players and commentators added their own reactions. And suddenly the entire incident became another chapter in the WNBA's rapidly growing cultural conversation. That's why this story matters beyond one game. It shows how difficult it has become for players to separate basketball from everything happening around basketball. The league is bigger. The audience is bigger. The personalities are bigger. And the consequences of every public moment are bigger. For Sophie Cunningham, the incident became another highly publicized moment in a season where her profile has continued to grow. For DJ Carrington, it became a controversy that extended far beyond the ejection itself. And for the WNBA, it became another reminder that every major confrontation is now going to be examined from multiple angles. The smartest conclusion isn't that one side automatically owns the entire truth. The smarter conclusion is that the foul, the post, and the reactions afterward are three separate parts of the same story. The foul can be judged by basketball rules. The post can be judged by its wording and timing. And the motive behind both should be discussed carefully unless the people involved provide evidence themselves. That's the line between analysis and speculation. And in a controversy this emotional, that line matters. Because at the end of the day, the WNBA doesn't need another argument where everyone chooses a side before examining what actually happened. It needs the game itself to remain at the center. The players can compete hard. The officials can make difficult calls. Fans can criticize those decisions. And players can speak about issues that matter to them. But when all of those things collide, the audience deserves something more than outrage. They deserve context. And this controversy has shown exactly how quickly that context can disappear when two words become bigger than the basketball play that started everything. So now I want to hear what you think. Was DJ Carrington's white privilege post clearly connected to the Sophie Cunningham foul? Or do you believe people interpreted her words without enough context? And when you look at the actual play, do you think the officials made the right decision by giving Carrington a flagrant 2 and ejecting her? Drop your opinion in the comments, because this debate clearly isn't going away anytime soon. If you enjoyed this breakdown, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next major WNBA story. There's always another controversy around the corner, and we'll be here to break down what actually happened.